Hey everybody, it is Chris, and today I'm going to show you guys how you can blur your background in your photograph using Corel Paint Shop Pro. Now I do want to go over a couple different things first before we actually get into the blurring of the background. Now, I've gotten this question a lot about how to blur the background in a photograph, and I want to make sure that everybody understands the difference between actually using a lens that does blur the background as opposed to post-production going in after and applying the blur to the background. Now, when you buy a lens using this kind of special technique that has a what they call low aperture, means that you can get your aperture ring down to about a 1.4, which makes it wide open. That will entail how blurry the background is going to be opposed to your subject that you're photographing. So basically, the lower the aperture on your lens, the bigger the aperture hole, if that makes any sense, a little backwards, that when you take that photograph, it's either going to really blur the background and keep your subject in focus, or if you have a lower aperture, such as an f14, it's going to keep everything else in focus. So when using a camera, a lot of us in professional photography, we invest in these lenses so that we do not have to do this in post-production, because you can see, or most of the time, 99% of the time, you can tell the difference between an actual lens that takes actual blurry photographs in the background, which adds that bokeh, as they also call it, to the background, or adds that really good depth of field, to one that if you take it in after and then you apply that effect after. There's definitely a change and definitely a difference in how that photo looks depending on what you do. So for instance, on this photograph here, I used a 1.8 aperture 35mm lens. Now, the reason why I got this lens is because it adds that beautiful bokeh, that beautiful blurriness to the background while the subject is in focus. And this does it within camera, so I do not have to go to post-production and worry about it. Plus, like I said earlier, if you do it in post-production, it will not provide the same exact look that a lens would when you're using it in camera. Now, of course, these lenses can be very expensive and not everybody can afford them, and not everybody is trying to become a professional photographer. They're just enthusiasts. These lenses can go anywhere from $250 up to $2,500 to $3,000, depending on what kind of lens you get, because it has better glass and it has a quicker aperture or a quicker f-stop. So the photographs come out really, really beautiful. Have this nice little bokeh in the background, just really great for portrait photography. Now, I do my photography for part of my living, and so I invest in these lenses because it provides me with that great quality portrait look that my clients want. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware of the difference. When you guys see a photograph that has a beautiful bokeh in the background, most likely that photographer has a lens that provides that bokeh. So just keep that in mind, because when I'm showing you these techniques, it is going to be different as you edit the photograph, and you'll see that it's not really, it doesn't have that kind of natural look to it that you would like most of the time. So now that that's said, let's get to the nuts and bolts of this. So I'm going to show you guys several different ways to blur the background. And of course, I'm going to duplicate my background here. And as we do that, the reason why I duplicate is just make sure I do have my original copy down below. And I'm going to rename this blur background. Now, the first way that you can do this is, like I said before, I talked about depth of field a little bit. Depth of field is telling you what is blurry in the background and what is in focus. So right here you have a depth of field option that is built into Corel Paint Shop Pro. Now, I am not sure if this is an X5. I think it is. I'm pretty sure it is. I think it's an X4 as well, but I know that it's an X6 and X7. So I'm going to click on my depth of field option here, and you're going to have your depth of field module appear. I'm going to click on preview on image so you guys can see it right here. Now, you have a couple different options that you can do. You have a circular selection tool, you have a freehand selection tool, and you also have the rectangular selection tool. What this allows you to do is to take a selection in the style that you want. So if you want a circular selection, you would use the circular tool right here. For instance, you see where that cross is? I'm going to place that cross right over me, and I'm going to left click, and then I'm going to drag down. As I do that, it's going to adjust and process the photograph to show that I now have that blur and I am in focus within that circle. Now, if you want to do it, you can do freehand, and also you can use the rectangular selection tool, which is up to you, whichever effect that you're looking for, what you want to do. So you just do the same thing. If you had this the freehand selection tool here, all you would do is just simply left click and then draw around the subject. And then what it's going to do is process the photograph again. It's going to adjust it, and then it's going to blur that part of the photograph that is around the selection. Now, when you come down here, you're going to see the blur option. This is how you're actually going to intensify or adjust the amount of blur that you're using. Now, the more blur you use, the less realistic it's going to look, unless you're doing some kind of artistic effect. So, for instance, if I go up to 65, you're going to see this just go blur crazy. And it does take a little time to process doing this, because it is manipulating all sorts of pixels, just like with any other photograph that you edit using any other kind of technique in the Corel Paint Shop Pro software, or even Photoshop or other things like that. It does take a little while for it to adjust. Now, since I went so high, it's taking a little bit longer for it to kind of go around, because what it's doing is it's looking all around my selections, going blur this, blur that, blur this, blur that, and it has to move the pixels a little bit, add these little smudges to the pixels. So you're going to see here, once it finally loads, that took forever, you're going to see obviously that that looks absolutely unrealistic. Absolutely unrealistic. And I try to keep everything as much of a realistic as I can. So what I'm going to do is go down to maybe about, let's do a 9. And what that's going to do is just add a soft blur to the background. Let's even do a little bit more here. We'll do a 6. And that looks good to me. That looks good. Now, still right here, you can see that where it cuts off, where the bokeh is, where the blurriness is. Now, if you used a professional lens, this wouldn't happen. The bokeh would be right up next to the person, even a little bit over the person right here, depending on what aperture setting you have it to. If it's a 1.4, you would have it, right here, 1.8, and so on. But with this effect, you're going to see that you have that line. So what you basically could do, if you wanted to, is you could actually draw around the subject. So let me show you here for a second. So you see where this is right here, that I just kind of did a raw circle. And you're going to see on the line here that you have this raw drawing that's not blurry. It's not blending in very well, and it looks very unrealistic. But what you can do if you want to is you can draw around your subject. And of course, I'm using my mouse for this. That's why it's so messed up. If I had my Wacom tablet, this would be a lot easier. Now, when you do that, let me just get around myself here. This is not going to be the greatest, just to kind of give you guys an idea. So when I do that, you're going to see that I have a more realistic effect, because the blur is on the background a little bit more. And I'm actually going to lower this down even just a little bit more. So let's do a 3. This is more natural. Now you see it has kind of that natural look. Now still, I would rather get this in camera, but you can see that you can get a little bit more of that blurriness in the background, so you can adjust it as you see fit. Now, the other thing down here that I do want to mention to go over is the invert selection. What that's going to do is invert what your selection does. So right now, it's telling, or I'm telling the program that I want this to stay in focus, and I want everything outside of this to go blurry. If I click invert, I'm telling it that I want everything on inside of this selection to go blurry and everything on the outside to stay sharp. So when I click invert, you're going to notice here that I turn blurry, background turns sharp. So that's what the invert button is there for. Now right down here, you can adjust the aperture shape. This is really not going to affect anybody that is really doing this more for a family kind of portraiture or anything like that. This just tells you what kind of shape you want the aperture to be. The circle or a little hexagonal shape right here, aperture shape. It's not really going to make too much of a difference, so I really wouldn't worry about that too much. You can just keep it on the circle if you want to. The feathered edge, that is what's going to provide this kind of blend, this feather edge blend to the photograph, which makes it look a little bit more realistic. So that's what that's going to do. Focus range, now if I go up high here, you're going to see obviously as this changes, the focus range is looking at how much of me or my selection is in focus. And it's really subtle, especially when I have it this way so close, that you can't really tell, but it does adjust that a little bit and give you a little bit more control over it. So right now I'm going to hit cancel on here, and that is the depth of field tool. So just remember, if you go over to adjust, you go to, where am I? Depth of field. You click on that, you'll have your depth of field module here, and you can obviously make those changes if you want to. Now, the one I'm going to show you guys now is what I typically do when I am doing any kind of artsy-fartsy kind of stuff using the blur technique. I'm going to make sure I do have my duplicate layer here, and I'm going to go to adjust, and I'm going to go to blur. Now, there's a couple different options here. Average will just give you an average, top of the line, most commonly used blur effect. So if I click on that, you're going to see the blur effect, and you can adjust it a little bit to what you want. So if you want it extreme or you want it lower or so on, you can do that. And I'm going to show you guys why I'm doing this in a second. So we'll go over to blur again. Blur is just going to blur the photograph automatically. You can't adjust it, anything like that. It just does a common blur. And then we'll go over to adjust again. Go down to blur. We're going to go blur more. That obviously means that if you're not satisfied with your blur and you want to blur it a little bit more, click on blur more, and it will add some blur to that photograph. Then you have Gaussian blur, which a lot of the time I use. That's why I have a shortcut key for it. Gaussian blur allows to give a lot of people will use it in skin smoothing, actually, which I should go over at some point in time. A lot of people will use that to kind of smooth out the skin slightly and adds a little slightly effect when using layers. But if you click on Gaussian blur, you do have your options here as well. You can go up to 47. Of course, adds way too much blur. And you can also go down to the 2.0 here. And go to adjust again. We go to blur. We're going to see motion blur. Now, motion blur is specifically used for photographs if you have a subject running or moving at a fast pace. So say you have a kid, one of your kids is running around and you got a photo and it's freezing them, but the background's still in focus, because most cameras that you buy, most point and shoot cameras, have an aperture or an f-stop of about 5.6, which allows you to get most of the photograph, or as much as you can, within focus, and gives you little blur on the background. So if you want to add that motion blur, you just click on motion blur, and you see that it is the blur, if you notice, has a different look to it. The blur is kind of going at an angle, and this is where you can adjust your angle. So if I go down here and say I want to make it so it's kind of down below, you see how the blur is going down. I hope you guys can see that. So you can actually adjust the angle of the blur on where you want. So for instance, say if you have your subject running to the left. Now when you're capturing them, you're panning. What we would normally do is pan your camera with the subject to the left, snap a shot, then you would see blurriness all in the background, but the subject would be in focus. So what you have to think about when using this is that if your child or subject or whatever you're photographing is moving to the left, you want the angle of the blur to be to the right, because everything is moving so fast in that sense. It's kind of backwards how it works. So say if I'm right here and I'm running across, when you're panning, everything else is going that way because you're panning right across, so the background is going to be going to the right side. So what you want to do is just kind of make sure that your angle is about to the right. And then when you erase in your subject, you'll see that it adds that more natural blur. And of course, you can change the strength of the blur as well. Now, I recommend not going too high unless you're doing some kind of real race car thing. And then that's great. You could use even that kind of blur if you get a nice race car effect. And the reason why you would use the motion blur is because if you're doing some kind of production or some kind of commercial shoot and you do not have the time to actually go out and watch the car race around, you can take a photograph of the car sitting still and add this motion blur in after, and then do some more tweaks to it to give it that effect so it looks like it's actually riding down the street, or you took a photograph of this car flying right by. So that's what motion blur is used for, and that's how you'd make those adjustments. Now, there's also, if I go to adjust, we do have down here radial blur. Now, radial blur is going to add this cool effect where the center of the subject, just a little bit of it, is going to be in focus, and the rest is a radial circle, a blurring circle around it. Now, the reason for this blur is because you can actually do a trick with your lens. If you're taking a photograph and you actually zoom in as you're taking a photograph, it can actually add a circular blur to the background of your subject. Now, it's very hard to do because you have to have your shutter open for about a second and try to keep your camera as still as possible to get the sharpest look of the subject that you're photographing. But you can probably find videos on this on YouTube of how to do it, but you'd basically just snap a picture, and as you click it, you move the lens, zoom it in or zoom it back, and it'll add this kind of blur. So it'll add a radial blur. And this is just an example of what it could look like, but again, it depends on how you use your lens and your camera. So there's a couple different options that we have here to look at. We have the blur type. So if we click on spin, it's going to give it a spin blur type. It looks like a regular circle. We're going to go to zoom. It's going to give it like you're zooming in or out, and this is the kind of effect that you normally get when you do that. The twirl is going to give you this twirl circle effect within the blur. Now, obviously, you have your strength of the blur you can do. The twirl degrees, which this is kind of interesting how this does this, but if you look right here, you're going to see a change. That the degrees of the twirl change a little bit. It's not that majorly noticeable, but it does change. There we go. Okay, now it finally changed it up there. So you see how it's changing the degrees or how close it is. So if we go down lower here, you're going to see they're closer together. And if we go up 29, you're going to see that they're a little more farther apart. So see that? This is a cool technique that you can use. Elliptical. If you click off elliptical, you're going to see it's a change that to me is not really major. You're going to see it kind of change right up here. It's going to try to make an elliptical look. It doesn't really do much. Enough for me to even want to ever use it. I just keep elliptical clipped. I never deselect it or anything like that. Now, this is where you can make some pretty cool changes. If you want to move around this radial blur, say you want it to be over here or over there, up or down, this is where you're going to do it. Horizontal offset, so I'm just going to go over to 47. Now watch the center of this. Keep your eye right on here. You see how it moved? It's now here. So if I want to do a vertical offset, we'll do this. Now keep an eye on the blur and watch where it goes, because basically you're moving the center part of this blur, okay? Now if you wanted to protect the center, what it's going to do is try not to blur that as much as possible. And let me actually, once this renders, let me get back to 0 here so I can show you guys what I mean. And of course it's going to process it each time that you do a setting, which again I wish it wouldn't do. I wish it would allow you to change the settings in there and then add them later. So right now it says protect center, so I want to do 100% on protecting the center. It's going to do is if you look right around it, it's making this a little bit more in focus. It's trying to make this a little bit sharper. Now if I go down lower, let me go up to, didn't mean to do that. Obviously you're going to see it comes up with that. So the lower you get, it's not protecting the center anymore. Now it adds a pretty cool look. To be honest, this is pretty cool. I would probably say this as a desktop background if I could. So this does add some cool effects to it as well. So what I'm going to do now is show you guys how you would actually use this and how you would show yourself in the photograph. So I first wanted to go over, of course, the different kinds of blurs. Now that we've talked about that, let's talk about how you can use this. So if we go to blur, I'm just going to click on blur, just blurring my photograph. I'm going to go over to my erase tool. And all I'm going to do is erase myself back in. It's that simple. So I'm just sitting here, erasing myself back in. Sure, I'm a little in focus here. And that's all I'm doing. It's very simple. These techniques are very, very simple. And you can add so much and play around with them if you want to get whatever effect you want to. So now I have a blur in the background, and that to me looks, because it's not too blurry on the background, that looks pretty good. It's not too bad. Of course, you would take a little bit more time in doing this to get the effect that you want. So all you have to do is erase yourself back in. It's literally that simple. So I'm going to go back here and we will try another one. So that was just a blur. So let me go down to, let's do radial blur. They all use the same technique that I just did. All you do is erase yourself back in. So we're happy with that. That's what we want to do. So I'm just going to erase myself back in. That's it. So these add some cool and interesting effects if you want to. I'm just kind of getting my arms and stuff here so you can see. There you go. So you have yourself in focus, but you have this kind of radial blur that goes around everything as you use it. And I'm going to sit here. Nah, I don't want to do anything like that just yet. I'll do that in another one. So you can erase yourself back in, and that is just how it looks. So this is how you can add blur to your background, depending on what kind of thing you're looking for. You have the depth of field option here, that if you click on that, it will give you the depth of field, which is what most lenses have, or what we talk about when having the background blurred and the subject in focus. You are changing or adjusting your depth of field. Then you go down to over here, you have the blur option where you can simply just blur, blur more, Gaussian blur, motion blur, or radial blur. And again, just duplicate your layer and just do that. And if you screw up, you just delete it, duplicate another layer, start over. Absolutely that simple, not very hard at all. So I hope this helped anybody out that was asking questions about this. And I did receive a question actually earlier, I think 2 days ago, about this. So this is literally all you have to do to get the blurry background, and you can play around with it, adjust it the way you want to, be creative with it, and do whatever your heart desires. Remember, it's your creativity, and it's how you want the picture to look. That's what matters. If you like it, then go for it and create that picture. So if you guys have any questions, please leave them down in the comments section below, or check out o'neillchris.wordpress.com for more information. And as always, thanks for watching, guys. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.